In this segment, where we're going to return to the Alexander the Great's empire that he has now built and he lived to see constructed, but did not live long enough to see it thrive. In this map that we showed earlier, and we'll use it again here, we have this idea of how large the empire he created was. That there's a significant, he's on 3 different continents, the way we think of that. He also is controlling multiple numbers of languages and different peoples and different cultures. But when he dies in 323 BCE, he does not leave behind a clear heir, and there is not a clear sense of who's in charge. And as we had talked about very briefly earlier, it's now going to break down into a series of military men trying to seize various kingdoms and chunks of this empire and continue to use it in terms of creating their own wealth, but also taking a look at the idea that they will be trying to create their own separate empires. So now, we go back to this idea of this is the creation of a Hellenistic world. And what we mean by that is simply a Greek-like world. The Greeks control the military situation, political situation, and the economic situation in many of these new city-states, as well as these new empires and kingdoms. And they're going to be the sort of the lingua franca, as we say. The language that's in common amongst the elites will be Greek. And if you do not learn Greek or dress like a Greek or act like a Greek, it's doubtful that you're going to be able to break into the sort of the upper echelons of society, the elite classes. That is seemingly reserved for Greek peoples. And increasingly, we see in these Greek successor kingdoms, and one of the more successful ones is going to be run by Ptolemy. Ptolemy was a man who was one of Alexander's military companions, and when the situation after Alexander's death is very chaotic, he's the one that ends up taking over control of what you know as the modern-day state of Egypt, and increasingly he and his ancestors will control Egypt all the way until 30 BCE and the Roman Empire. And we'll get back to his descendant later, Cleopatra. We'll remember her. In this context, then, the Greeks now have an opportunity to unify the nations of the world under a Greek control and Greek language, but also increasingly the idea of, remember, cultural borrowing always is that as people go out into the world, they bring their customs and cultures, they interact sometimes with those of the people around them, and there's some sort of mutual exchanges. The Greeks, remember, had that idea earlier of the sort of like, well, we're Greek and everybody else is a barbarian. So there is a barrier between the full integration of the Greeks and the people they now control. It's not going to happen seamlessly. It's going to happen very slowly, if at all. And for the most part, in many places, since Greek superiority is already an issue, they're going to continue to maintain that. All right? So in the context of what we're talking about, all those different empires now, all those different city-states and other areas that are now under Greek control will break into pieces over time. And of course, Ptolemy's Egypt is one of the bigger ones and more important ones. There are others, but I'll leave it to the textbook that you're using to see some of the rest of those as examples. But the one in Ptolemy's Egypt is probably the one that's most important and famous for us and stands for the rest. But now they have a common Hellenistic urban culture. And the Greeks now will be able to rule this empire. Ptolemy here, and here's a bust of him. Ptolemy will be the first of a series of emperors and pharaohs in the Egyptian context who will control Egypt and have a very important Greek city-state base at Alexandria, the city that's founded at the delta of the Nile, and will continue to control the traditional Nile River Valley, where the vast majority, of course, of the Egyptians live, and assume the entire idea of the pharaoh. In time, Ptolemy, as a military leader from Greek culture, is going to become increasingly like his subjects in Egypt. And remember, in some of the earlier dynasties of Egypt, what had happened was that the royal family of the pharaoh was considered so sacred, so divine, and so connected to the deities that oftentimes they married siblings. Siblings married siblings within the traditional Egyptian culture. That's not something that was predicted in Greek culture, but increasingly as Ptolemy is in Egypt, under the influences of Egyptian ideas, increasingly he is going to, and his family as well, adopt the various ideas of Egyptian culture and society to help blend in. But they're always going to maintain a sort of distinctive Greek culture, especially in urban areas where they have political control. So, another key element to emphasize here is that this new Hellenized, widespread Greek empire is going to be very powerful as a trade network. Now, the major traders who are carrying goods and services all around the empire have a common language, Greek, and a common series of cultural ideas and dress and fashion and behavior issues, so that the idea of doing business actually gets easier. You don't have to have a series of breakdowns by language and things like that. Instead, you have a much more of a commonality, and things seem to get done a lot faster. And also with the basic security issues, with the Greeks in charge in all these areas of Alexander's old empire, for a business person and for a business activity, it's safer. There's a more guaranteed security, and if there are some legal issues or problems, then you can work it out in Greek, or have the opportunity to at least discuss issues. It just is going to make things easier, and it's going to help foster trade. Especially because the urban areas, remember, where there is a hyper-concentration of wealth, there will be more markets for exotic goods that are being transported from long distances. And one of the side effects of Alexander conquering the Persian Empire is traditionally the Persian Empire and their emperors had sort of stockpiled gold and silver and other precious things and sort of kept them for a rainy day, and increasingly taking all that gold and silver out of circulation in the economy. It in many ways had stored up a very large bank account, so to speak, and when the Greeks come in and take Persia, they inject that gold and silver and the other precious things back into the economy, and it does spur more business activity and more trade. Another thing that's going to happen is, think of it this way. Let's say you're an ambitious young man or woman back in Greece, and you hear that there's not many opportunities for you in your local city-state, in your local polis, but you hear from your cousin that there's an opportunity for you, a business or a job opportunity of some sort with government in one of the Greek city-states of the old empire of Alexander. It could be in Egypt, it could be in Asia Minor, it could be in old Mesopotamia. There is a net exodus. There are Greeks who leave Greece to go and find opportunities in the rest of the Hellenistic world. We'd seen this earlier, remember, when the Greek city-states had colonized many of the places along the shoreline of the Mediterranean, as well as the Black Sea. So the idea of exporting Greeks from Greece is not a new idea, but here's the next wave of them as they go out and find opportunities in this larger, now more stable Hellenistic empire. Another thing for us to consider is this has been now an opportunity for us to take a look at a lot of different cultures so far in our first units. Notice that in essence, every single one of them has some form of slavery, and that slavery is the backbone of a lot of economic activity, especially in some places where slaves are used as agricultural laborers. Other places they're specified to say weavers or clay workers or masons, that many of the peoples of the world who were conquered are put into slavery. And in many areas of the ancient world, slavery is accomplished in several different ways. First, prisoners of war oftentimes are made into prisoners of war are oftentimes made into slaves. In other cases, the children of slaves, are also considered slaves. And in some societies, a form of sort of personal bankruptcy, and we'll talk about this more in Rome, is if you go so deep into debt, you end up selling yourself to settle your debt as best you can to whoever you owe money to. So there's lots of ways that people become slaves, but let's notice so far that it is not necessarily, it's not racial, it's an economic issue. It also is an issue of power that in many ways is going to be something that will play out in the next couple of cultures we talk about. Slavery is sort of a bedrock principle that exists in many of them. It is economically efficient for most to use slavery, and it's going to in many ways also retard or slow down the development of that sort of classic middle class group of people, the artisans, the small shopkeepers. The very low nature of slavery in terms of its widespread use and low cost is going to retard that kind of economic development that we'll see later on in societies. Another thing we want to highlight here at this point in the Hellenistic society is the role of women. As you had seen earlier, say in Sparta, women had been called upon to do various family business activities and to conduct, sale of land or that sort of thing. They had been empowered by their families to do things, not in a sense that the women were equal, but out of the sense that all the Spartan men are involved in the war or in civic government, and somebody has to get the job done. And of course, Sparta had its own slavery system, and then of course women. In this Hellenistic society we're talking about now, there are expanded roles for women, especially from the elite classes who are involved in long-distance trade families or in military families. And you'll start to see the rise of women in terms of showing up on some coinages of some of the ancient empires we're talking about. Also, the daily role of women in terms of supplicating or asking for favors from the government, writing letters through a scribe. We also see an increase in literacy and literacy activity amongst women, as well as some more increased business activity, especially at the lower level. Remember, in many poor families, everybody has to work, so the idea that a woman was staying at home all the time doing nothing, that's a myth. The vast majority of women are, of course, out there working in the marketplace, but they don't have the legal or other status that a man does. So as we come together here at the end of this unit on the Hellenistic world, we're now having the idea of those exclusively sort of Greek ideas that were isolated to Greece itself. Now they're being spread even wider, first through colonization centuries ago, now through actual military occupation and the control of these areas by Greeks. They're going to bring their culture, their ideas, and it's going to be a very powerful cultural legacy as we see the spread of Greek language, Greek architecture, and other signs of this Hellenization. Be sure to check out what you need to in your textbook reading, and also be sure to do those sample questions.